Vance. I work with the Department of Environmental Conservation as a watershed planner and put together this draft tactical basin plan for the Lake Memphremagog watershed. But maybe before we get started, might as well just go around and do some introductions since we have a pretty small group. So I don't know if you just want to say your name and if you kind of work with a group or have a particular interest, that'd be great. Let's drop that.
I'm Beth Murphy. I'm the water quality planner for the region, and I work for Northeastern Vermont Development Association, NPDA.
Mark McKenzie with MWA.
Patrick Early, project manager at MWA.
May Carter, I'm the Conservation Science Director at the Northwood Stewardship Center.
Michelle, I just recently moved to Derby and have always been interested in water issues,
Okay.
so that's why I'm here.
Jennifer Hopkins, MWA.
Pam Lads, NWA, and a couple of other organisations, and tonight I'm NEK-TV.
Great.
Jim, and I like fly fishing, and I'm interested in the watershed,
Oh, great.
water quality, and
Yep.
anything else.
Yep.
Brian Dickinson with MWA in the high school.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you're part of the new kind of limited group that's getting together up in the kingdom, or if not, we might be able to connect you with, I think they're meeting on June 6th or something, coming right up, so. Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate people coming out on a beautiful night, and maybe this can be a relatively quick meeting. But definitely want to go over the basin plan, and there's actually, it's a pretty long document and there's a lot in it, so I'll probably zip through some stuff, but if you have questions, feel free to just jump right in. We have a pretty small group tonight. So we're going to talk a little bit about the basin planning process, talk about some of our high quality waters and what we call reclassification, where we can kind of set a higher bar for some of those waters, talk about the water quality issues that we have across this watershed, dive in a little bit into the Lake Memphremagog Cleanup Plan, or TMDL, and then I'll spend a good chunk of the day, or the talk, talking about the strategies that we have, and that's really the key part of the Tactical Basin Plan, which is really our recipe for how we're going to protect and restore waters across the watershed, and then open it up for any public comment. So a little bit about the Tactical Basin Planning process. So the state of Vermont's broken up into 15 different watersheds, and for a little confusing reason, we call this one Basin 17 because there used to be two others that got lumped together. But I cover Lake Memphremagog, Passumpsic, and Upper Connecticut. And every 5 years, we develop a tactical basin plan for each of these basins. We start off with a year of doing water quality monitoring. Then we take a year to look at all that data, kind of assess that data, figure out what the water quality conditions are in the watershed. Then we take all that information, and I do a lot of meetings with partners, so Patrick and Meg and other folks in the room here, to really look at all that data and figure out what we need to do to protect and restore water quality. And then we bring the plan out for public comment. And then we have 1 year off, but really essentially the whole time we're out there implementing projects. We're doing tracking and accounting to kind of see the improvements that we're making across the watershed. And then we have a focus on a couple of the different sectors of the watershed that we dive into a little bit. And the other bit of background information is that the basin plan really focuses on non-regulatory issues, so we don't dive into regulated entities so much. It's really a focus on the non-regulatory efforts out there that are needed to restore water quality. So, just a little bit about the basin. So just a couple of maps here. One thing that's kind of unique about this basin is we have Lake Memphremagog, where most of the water is up in Quebec. It's also the drinking water supply for Sherbrooke, so about 180,000 people depend on the lake for their drinking water. But most of the watershed is in Vermont, so we have the Black, Barton, and Clyde River that flow into Lake Memphremagog. But also included as part of this basin is Stearns Brook watershed that flows into the Tomophobia and eventually into Lake Massawippi, which also has some similar water quality issues as Lake Memphremagog, so it has some elevated phosphorus levels. So that's a focus for that watershed. And then over the Averill Lakes in Norton flow north in the Quaticook into the river Massawippi, and that's all part of the St. Francis River watershed. So Normally, and for most of the plan, we just kind of cut the world off at the border. But in reality, it is an international watershed, and we have what's called the Quebec-Vermont Steering Committee on Lake Memphremagog that meets twice a year to really talk about collaboration around Lake Memphremagog. So this map over here shows the land use in the watershed. So most of the Quaticook watershed is pretty well forested with a little bit of development around the Averill Lakes. Also, the headwaters of the Clyde and the upper Barton River are pretty well forested. But you can see these areas in yellow, pretty intensive agricultural land use along the Black, Lower Barton, and Clyde rivers. And then the red is the developed areas around Derby and Newport and a little bit around Orleans as well. And then some of the most intensely developed land is actually around some of our lakes and ponds. They don't show up so much on these maps, but you know, when you look at it really in close, you can see a line of red around most of those lakes with some pretty intense shoreline development. So in terms of the planning process, we started in early 2022 with the survey that we put out. We had a kickoff meeting in June of 2022. And then over the last year, we've had some meetings with the key partners to develop the strategies on a bunch of different topics. And right now we have the draft plan posted for public comment, and we're hoping to get that finalized by July of this year. So now a little bit about the water quality, or some of our good water quality. So we have a couple of lakes, Lake Seymour, Echo Lake, Willoughby, and Shadow Lake, that all meet the criteria for what's called Class A1, and so that means that the phosphorus concentration is on average below 12 micrograms per liter. And the normal standard for all of our lakes across the state of Vermont is 18 micrograms per liter, so it's a little bit of a stricter criteria for that phosphorus, and so those are some of our cleaner, deeper lakes. We also have a couple of small streams where we have good fish and bugs, and so those are potential for reclassification as what we call a B1 for fish, for aquatic biota. And then there are 19 streams. I don't have a good map of that, where we've identified good populations of trout species, and so we've identified those as being potential B1 for fishing use. And then we have a couple of wetlands as the Black and Barton Rivers go into South Bay, and then the Upper Clyde River area here as our some potential what are called Class 1 wetlands. And so we kind of identify these in the plan, but to make this happen, a petition needs to go forward. And so right now we have active petitions for Echo Lake and Shadow Lake, and those are on hold while we're trying to figure out this issue where reclassifying a lake as an A1 means that you can't have septic systems that have more than 1,000 gallons per day of flow. And so we were trying to do a legislative fix over this past year, but that didn't come to pass. So I'm not sure kind of where those efforts are, but it's going to hopefully keep plugging along, and we really hope over the course of this 5-year plan that we'll make some progress in reclassifying some of those lakes. So that's the good. The bad, actually not as much as we see in some other parts of the state. But we do have 2 impaired rivers. So there's Roaring Brook, which flows out of Parker Pond, and then we have this small tributary to Stearns Brook that are considered impaired due to high levels of nutrients from agricultural runoff. We have 6 lakes that are considered impaired. So we have duck and halfway ponds that are impaired due to acidification. We have 3 that are impaired for phosphorus, so Lake Memphremagog, Walker Pond, and Mud Pond, which are 2 small ponds that have, again, a lot of agricultural runoff draining to them. And those are impaired for elevated levels of phosphorus. And then we have Lake Salem that's impaired because of elevated levels of mercury in fish tissue. And then it's not impaired, but if you haven't had a chance to look at our lake scorecard, it's the way that we evaluate the conditions of all of our lakes around the state of Vermont, and we have this little circle here, what's called the Secchi disc, and we break it into 4 quadrants. In the upper left is the nutrient trends. And so one of the concerns that we see is out of the 58 lakes in the watershed, we see 13 of those lakes have a statistically significant increasing nutrient trend. And that includes many of those lakes that are those potential A1 lakes, so Willoughby, Echo, and and shadow lakes all have a statistically increasing nutrient trend, and so it's something that we want to get ahead of before those lakes cross that boundary and are no longer showing that good water quality. And so we're not exactly sure why we're seeing those increasing nutrient trends, and the nutrient levels are still low enough that we don't consider them impaired, but it's still something that we want to get out there and try to proactively address those issues. Because it's much easier to try to prevent things from getting impaired than to try to restore it. So in terms of Lake Memphremagog, it's kind of unique in the state of Vermont. Lake Memphremagog and Lake Champlain have specific nutrient criteria that are in our water quality standards. And so we have a target for Lake Memphremagog of 14 micrograms per liter. And the levels in the lake are typically around 18 or 19 is our average annual phosphorus level. And so these graphs just show the red is our target concentration, and you can see these are all of our data points across a couple of different sampling programs, and we're pretty consistently above that red line. And because we have those elevated levels of phosphorus, we tend to get cyanobacteria blooms in the lake. And so it's certainly not as bad as you see in some areas of Lake Champlain. But when they happen, they can be definitely impact the recreational use of the lake and are certainly a health concern and can require some beaches to be shut down. So the primary way to try to reduce those cyanobacteria blooms is try to reduce the amount of phosphorus getting into Lake Memphremagog. So because of that, in 2017, we developed a phosphorus budget for the lake. And so that's, the first step was really to figure out where all the phosphorus going into Lake Memphremagog was coming from. And for those that don't know, phosphorus is in fertilizers, manure, but most of the phosphorus actually gets into the lake attached to sediment or things that are causing erosion of sediment into our surface waters are the primary drivers of that phosphorus. And we did some modeling and we estimated that almost half of that phosphorus is coming from agricultural land uses. A little over 20% is coming from developed lands. About 20% is coming from our stream erosion and stream systems, bringing a fair amount of sediment into and phosphorus into the watershed. And then a little over 10% from water, wetlands, and forest and shrub areas. And so as part of this TMDL, we set reduction targets for each one of those areas of the watershed. So from our agricultural fields, we have a target reduction of 46%. From our agricultural production areas, we're trying to reduce that by 64%. We have a 20% reduction target for our developed lands, about a 33% reduction in our wastewater permitted loading, a 23% reduction from our stream systems, and a 5% reduction across our forest land. So we need to do all of those reductions to get from our about 18 micrograms per liter that we currently see in the lake to get to that 14 micrograms per liter. And as part of that, we also have a pretty big margin of safety because there's a fair amount of uncertainty. So we did that about 5 years ago, and over the last 5 years, we've been implementing projects, and we've been trying to track how much progress we're making in terms of reducing phosphorus to Lake Memphremagog. So this upper graph here, this is the kind of base load modeling that we did. And this is our target concentration, where if we reduce phosphorus by 15.2 metric tons, we estimate that we'll be meeting our water quality standards. And you can see we've been increasing our phosphorus reductions a little bit each year, and we're about 1.9 metric tons that we're estimating that we've reduced phosphorus loading coming into the lake, mostly through implementing agricultural practices. And so this graph over here kind of breaks that 1.9 metric tons down into the different source areas. So this is all of our agricultural reductions across our federal, state-funded agricultural practices and our regulatory programs. And then the thin green line here is our natural resource restoration projects. And then above that is our reductions from our roads and then stormwater. And you can see this graph just kind of shows it in the context of our TMDL reduction targets. But something that's important to note here is that we don't really have great ways to estimate phosphorus reductions across most of our river, lake, or wetland restoration projects. So as we figure out those tracking and accounting methodologies, we're expecting those numbers to go up quite a bit. And similarly, across the forested landscape, we're just now developing the ability to estimate how much phosphorus some of those projects may reduce. And the other new development is Act 76, which is a new funding program that supports what are called clean water service providers. So for the Lake Memphremagog watershed, that's the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And each year they get a target of phosphorus reduction. So I think this year it's 43 kilograms for this year, and they have roughly $643,000 in funding to provide grants to implement projects to achieve that phosphorus reduction target. And then we have what's called the Basin Water Quality Council, made up of representatives from some of the active groups, and so Patrick and Beth are on that, as well as Meg. And so a great group of people to help guide those implementation projects. And I think is it June 8th or 10th that we're going to do our first scoring round. And so we're hoping that because this is a sustainable funding source, and next year it's growing up to $700,000 in funding, that we're going to start to see those phosphorus numbers bump up because of this funding source. Okay, this is my last set of graphs and maps. And so one of the things that we have that's kind of unique for the Memphremagog watershed is we have a really extensive water quality monitoring program. And so we actually go out and we sampled 230 sites across the watershed. And we've been able to look at what the average concentration is above those sampling sites. And so essentially where we see those higher levels of phosphorus, we're drawing a line about 44 micrograms per liter or more. Those are the areas in yellows and oranges and reds. Those are some of our areas that we really want to focus our phosphorus reduction efforts. But then another thing that we've been able to do is looking at all of our tracking and accounting. We can look at that based on some of these different sub-watersheds. And so similar to that other graph, the yellow here is the phosphorus reductions that we've already achieved from our agricultural field practices. The orange is across our farmstead practices. And those large blue bars that's remaining is how much additional phosphorus reduction we need to achieve to meet our TMDL target. So you can see we've got a couple of these sub-watersheds. So the lower Black, the Willoughby, the lower Clyde, and the direct drainage to Lake Memphremagog are the areas that have the largest gap and the least progress. So those are areas that we really want to focus some of our outreach and implementation efforts. And one thing that I think is pretty exciting is we have a couple of farmers that the Orleans County Conservation District is working with that are pretty active in those watersheds. So I'm really hoping that through those efforts we start to see some increasing phosphorus reductions across those sub-watersheds. So that's a lot about phosphorus. And the reason is that that's the main thing that we identify as an impairment across the Lake Memphremagog watershed. But we also know there's a lot of other water quality concerns across the watershed. And so one thing we have is our per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. And so that was one thing that really came across in our public surveys as a pretty significant concern that people have with water quality in the Lake Memphremagog watershed. And so, in part because we knew about that concern in 2021, the state of Vermont, actually in coordination with COGISAF up in Quebec, did a monitoring effort on Lake Memphremagog to see what kind of concentrations we see in the lake and in some of the tributaries, and also in fish in the lake. And it turns out, those concentrations were actually pretty low. Most of the samples were non-detect in Lake Memphremagog. We had a couple of low detection limits that are pretty typical to what you find in other places of Vermont. So certainly concern, any level of these substances is a concern, but it's also something that we're really trying to deal with on a statewide basis in terms of trying to reduce how much of these substances are brought into the state and kind of limit that. So there isn't really a lot that we've identified to do on the watershed basis related to those substances. And I guess the one other main concern that we got in our public comment were concerns about the News Vermont, or the Coventry landfill that's owned by Casella. And so there are a lot of public concerns, and often that was related to those PFAS in relation to the leachate of the Coventry landfill. And so the reason we don't really dive into that too much in the tactical basin plan is because it's a regulated entity. And so, again, the tactical basin plan really focuses on those non-regulatory issues, and there's a public process tied in to the Coventry landfill. And it's also not something I'm an expert in, so if people have some comments on that, I'm happy to take those and I'll kind of bring them into our watershed management division, who are the folks that do some of the monitoring and permitting, as well as our waste management division that deals with that permitting. So not something that I'm an expert in at this point in time. So another concern that we have in the Memphremagog watershed is high rates of malignant melanomas on brown bullhead in Lake Memphremagog. And so this is something that came up about 10 years ago that we started noticing these high rates. And the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has been working pretty hard doing some monitoring of different contaminants that may have been driving this. And they really weren't able to identify what may have been causing these melanomas. And so they just received some additional funding working with the U.S. Geological Survey and the UVM to do a genomic analysis. And so we're really hopeful that that will give us some sense of what might be driving this. And again, from the basin planning perspective, it's really hard to dive into what we should do to address an issue if we don't know what's driving it. So we haven't really gone into that issue so much in the tactical basin plan. And we're really hopeful that through that fish and wildlife monitoring effort, we'll get some better information. And so we did get a lot of concerns around the phosphorus pollution, kind of the stuff I've been talking about for the most part tonight. And then also a desire for increased communication of water quality information. And so it seemed like the public was feeling like we're not necessarily getting great information out there, and probably should have done a better job advertising this meeting. I don't know. Maybe that's an indication of that, but it's something that we're certainly looking at. We didn't have a real clear strategy in the plan, so we're certainly open for suggestions around how we can do a better job of getting the word out there. And I know some of our partners like Northwoods and NWA, and then also NVDA are doing a lot of work trying to get the word out there. But I also know lots of people are pretty busy, so it's tough to break through sometimes. And then we also had some public forums with some farmers in the watershed who had some good suggestions in terms of ways we could better address some nutrient management issues. And then also support for sediment trapping in farm ditches, which is something that we're pretty excited about. So we're hoping to get some farmers to take us up on that. And then also just they identified a real need for support in grant writing. So in terms of the tactical basin plan, the real focus of the plan is the strategies table. And so we have 66 strategies that we identified that are really targeted actions to address those priority water quality issues and guide technical support and funding. And essentially the agency and our watershed partners use the tactical basin plan strategies to guide their work on the ground. And we evaluate the strategies at the beginning of the next planning cycle. And we identify priority watersheds for each of these strategies, towns, partners, and funding sources. So trying to make sure that we have the resources necessary to implement those. So I'm going to take a little time, and I don't know if any of you picked up the little handout. Essentially it has the same information on this, if it's hard to read the slide, but across our agricultural landscape, we've identified those target areas for work, which is essentially those 4 target sub-watersheds where we have a lot of work to do to meet those phosphorus reductions. We have our 2 impaired ponds and 2 stream watersheds where we know agricultural runoff is impacting those. Some of the lakes with increasing nutrient trends, we know we have some agricultural land use in those watersheds. And finally, we have those watersheds that we've identified based on our water quality monitoring. So let's really identified a number of areas that we want to focus this implementation work, and really trying to work with individual farmers to target those best management practices in those watersheds. We also did a neat project where they did some modeling that identified areas on the landscape that have the potential to trap phosphorus in the agricultural landscape. And so one of the things we want to do is try to use this model with some farmers to see how well that worked and see if we can implement some practices where this model identified those practices. And if we get some buy-in from the farmers, maybe we can expand that effort across the watershed. So also just improving our nutrient management practices on farms through workshops and financial support, supporting some monitoring efforts to track results, and then also tell farm success stories, and then supporting farm teams, conservation, equipment programs, soil health assessments, and farmer participation in the Pay for Phosphorus program. So those are our primary strategies across the agricultural landscape. And so when we get into the stormwater world, in Vermont, we do what are called stormwater master plans, where we look across the landscape and identify where there are some potential stormwater treatment practices. And so our main focus is to continue to implement those practices where we're able to, and the Watershed Association is working on one coming up here across
Notice to proceed was issued.
There we go. And so that's exciting that we have a big stormwater practice. This is actually a picture of one in Brighton that was put in a number of years ago. And then we have a couple of other ones that were identified across the watershed. And then also just, we have a new regulation that requires landowners with more than 3 acres of impervious surface that don't have a stormwater permit to get one and to treat that stormwater. So doing a little bit of outreach to try to support that work. And then dealing with some erosion from the stormwater outfalls. And then also working with residential landowners on smaller scale stormwater practices. So across our roads, we have a great group of the Northeast Kingdom Rivers and Roads Work Group. And so really working with that group to work with our municipalities in terms of water quality restoration efforts. Addressing some gully erosion issues with some of the stormwater outfalls on our roads and our class 4 roads. And then a real focus on looking at our private roads. So we have across the state of Vermont a municipal roads general permit that requires our towns to deal with a lot of the issues across our municipal roads. But there's a real opportunity through that clean water service provider funding to see if we can address some of the issues on our private roads. And then also working with the state of Vermont with our state transportation infrastructure to develop some stormwater practices for that. So now we're kind of going into the natural resource sector. So we have our rivers. And this is a picture from a couple of weeks ago when we were out on the now Fish and Wildlife owned property looking at some potential restoration opportunities. And so one of our strategies that we have for this basin is to figure out a way that we can estimate how much phosphorus reduction we get from different practices. So they have a tool that allows you to do that in Lake Champlain, but we don't have that available here. So developing that and working with local partners to make sure everyone is able to use it. Doing some targeted assessments of our stream systems where there might be some opportunities to restore those. And then looking at what we call process-based or low-tech restoration projects that are things like beaver dam analogs, and also what we call our hydroseeding, where we essentially hydroseed trees to create a much more effective buffer, and as opposed to planting trees every 10 feet, you can get a much more effective riparian area through that. Then we also have a real opportunity with right now all of the communities in the watershed are getting updated FEMA flood maps. And so there's a real opportunity to work with our communities to consider not just addressing what FEMA requires, which is how high the water gets, but looking at where rivers might move, which are called our river corridors. So considering if there's some opportunities to work with towns to adopt those bylaws. And then also implementing aquatic organism passage, strategic wood addition, and dam removal projects. And we have a ton of lakes in this watershed. It's one of the most unique aspects of this watershed is we do have, I think almost 60 lakes greater than 10 acres. So that's a pretty good number of lakes. And a real focus for this watershed is developing lake watershed action plans. And so these are really efforts to look at a whole lake watershed and look at all the different potential contributors of pollution and try to address those at that smaller scale. And so we have those going on right now for Shadow Lake, Lake Willoughby, Seymour, and Echo. And then we have a couple of other lakes, Salem, Crystal, and the Averils, where we want to try to implement those. And then we're also looking at a need to, those lake watershed action plans identify a lot of potential projects, so we really need to build the capacity to implement those projects around our lake shores. And then also there's a real need to address, or to try to address invasive species across the watershed, and it's exciting to know that we do have a new boat washing station going on Lake Memphremagog. But there's a real challenge with limited funding for that work across this watershed. So trying to be as strategic as we can in terms of those efforts. And then looking to increase protection for those high quality lakes through reclassification. And then the Lakes and Ponds program is also looking at another tool called Outstanding Resource Water Designation for a couple of our lakes and ponds, which is a similar way to add some protections, but a little bit different. And then finally we have our wetlands and forest lands. And so wetlands, we just really want to look for those wetland restoration projects, and kind of similar to rivers, we want to look at opportunities to understand how much phosphorus reduction we might get from those wetland restoration projects, and then really trying to develop and implement those projects across the watershed. And then we also have another neat opportunity with the wetlands program. In a couple of years, we're going to be coming through and mapping all the wetlands across the watershed. So right now our wetland maps are pretty inaccurate, so they're going to come through with some new tools and do that. And so there's a real opportunity to do some outreach to our municipalities and other folks, so people are aware of those efforts going on. And then across our forest sector, we're working right now on state lands to do forest road inventories, but we want to expand that onto our private road infrastructure and implement some forest road restoration projects. Also looking at addressing some of the gullies across our forested landscape, supporting a skidder bridge program, and then trying to address some of the erosion issues on our trails, working with some of the trail clubs. So that's about 66 strategies. It's kind of a lot to go through. And I'm not going to go through all the monitoring priorities, but if you want, at the end of the plan, we identify all the areas of the watershed. So this map over here with the gray watersheds are the areas where we have not done our biological monitoring. And so those are areas where we're interested in getting out there. We're obviously not able to sample all of those, so we have a prioritized list of those in a table at the back of the plan. But we also have a couple of streams where we have some water quality concerns that are out there. It's not enough to be confident that they're impaired, but we have some concerns, and so we want to get out there and do some additional water quality monitoring to determine the condition. And then we have some watersheds where it might be opportunities for reclassification, and we need some more data to determine that. So those are some other water quality monitoring priorities. So right now we have the plan out for public comment through June 10th. So kind of the process is for us to, we have, anyone can send me an email or anything in the mail, or we can take public comment at the meeting as well in terms of any input people have on the draft tactical basin plan. I did want to, this is our evaluation of the last tactical basin plan, where we also had 66 strategies. But from our last plan, about 30% of those we've completed. About 60% of the strategies are in progress, so we've made some progress on them, but we haven't quite completed them. And only about a little over 10% are ones that we haven't made significant progress on. So just indication that, to the degree that there are some areas out there that you think need some focus or work, having those things in the tactical basin plan does increase the chances of those getting put into place. So that's what I had for presentation. I know it's probably a lot, but
I have a question.
Yeah.
Since this is 2023, when's the next 5-year Is it 28 or are we just stick to
No, so
27?
we stuck, so essentially our monitoring cycle is set in stone.
Okay,
We're not getting our monitoring folks to move.
yeah,
So we're still kind of stuck on the 2022.
2027.
So essentially, this year is not our monitoring year, but next year will be. So 2024 will be our monitoring year. And then we'll have an assessment year, and then we'll kind of kick this process up again. So there'll be a little bit shorter of a implementation window for this one. But yeah, hopefully we'll keep on that. And it's interesting, over in Lake Champlain, the plans are kind of tied into the TMDL, and EPA kind of really keeps us online with that.
Mhm.
But we're about 6 months behind on this plan.
Pretty good considering.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot going on. I think it's an interesting watershed where over in Lake Champlain, you have the Lake Champlain Basin program, and you have a lot of people that are focused on that cleanup effort for Lake Champlain. And over in Lake Magog, it's kind of us, right? We're the team, and we do coordinate with folks up in Quebec, and I think we have some good collaboration there. But it's a little bit of a smaller scale, and so yeah, it does take maybe a little bit more to
Are
get
you
done.
looking at the impact of wake boats and churning up the bottom of the lake, which they do?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and not something I'm an expert in, but we do have the new wake boat rule that's being developed, and unfortunately, Lake Magog, as being in navigable water and international, is kind of excluded from that process because it has a different regulatory framework. And so I think there certainly are some concerns around how, to agree that might increase traffic in this area. And so it's certainly something that I know the Lakes and Ponds program is aware of, and I know they really tried to have some strict rules going along with that to limit the movement of those wake boats between lakes, because I think that's where
I
it's a
can
particular
speak to
concern.
that.
So yes.
Yeah. So there was a petition put forth to the state last year for regulating wake boats.
Right.
And they were requesting 1,000-foot safety zone, so on each side you had 1,000 feet, 60 contiguous acres, and I think it was 30-foot depth. What was originally submitted in the petition. Was it 20 feet or 30?
I think we want 20.
Okay, so anyhow, the state of Vermont, the Lakes and Ponds Division amended the petition, and there have been public meetings, and currently it's, using science-based studies. They've brought it down to 500 feet for the safety zone, 50 contiguous acres? Is
Yeah,
that what it is?
50.
And 20-foot depth. And originally, the original 1,000-foot safety zone would have left 15 lakes in the state that
Right.
wake boats would be allowed on. 11 of those were in the Northeast Kingdom, and 9 of those 11 had no invasive species yet. And of course, a huge issue with wake boats is it's not just the churning up of the water bottom, it's that they're a vector for invasive species transmission because it's a closed system and you can't fully empty it. So the new petition is, I think it's around 35 lakes in the state, so we won't have all of the wake boats
31.
being channeled up into the Northeast Kingdom now. And there's also a part of it called the home lake rule, and this is an important part, is that if you are one of the 35 lakes where wake boats are allowed, then you would get a sticker saying that that's your home lake and you're not allowed to go on another lake. So I'm at Seymour, so if somebody came into Seymour and they had an echo sticker, they wouldn't be allowed in Seymour. But if they had a Seymour sticker.
Decontamination, it's the decontamination.
Well, but the decontamination stations are going to be over by Burlington, so it's not super practical for that.
Yeah, I know, but you should say it in there.
Yeah.
It's-
So anyhow, that's where it stands right now. There's been a big push to keep the 1,000-foot safety zone. And
I like that.
Um,
I'm a swimmer and a kayaker. I would
Well,
really like that.
unfortunately, it wouldn't make any difference with Magog because it's an international waterway. And that's just the legal end of it. But with the other lakes in the watershed, it would be very helpful. And there was something else with that. Oh, so I think they're leaning right now towards perhaps upping it another 100 feet, so 600 feet safety zone, 50 contiguous acres and 20-foot depth. So it is in the process of being regulated. The amount of regulation is really what the question is right now.
And if you're
Anything
really
else, Jennifer?
interested, when's the public hearing? It's, there should be a, public hearing coming up in June
Right.
sometime. It's not been
Supposed to be.
announced yet, yeah.
We'd like it to come up quite soon.
Yes, everybody would, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, I think it's still a little new. I haven't heard of a lot of wake boats around as much. So I think like even with the home lake rule won't really address the kind of stirring up
We have
aspect
several
of it.
here,
So.
and they're certainly not following much regulation or common sense, so they are stirring up a lot. And the wake from them is crashing into places like Eagle Point.
Yep.
Well, you can contact enforcement people for that.
Yeah.
Like I said, like when from Agog, you're out of luck
Yeah.
unless
Yeah,
they.
we know.
Yeah, but you can contact enforcement people, you can take pictures and get the registration.
The wake that crashed into Eagle Point, the police on the lake were there at the time. They were appalled, and there was nothing they could do about it.
Huh,
I was in a kayak and I had a swimmer with me.
wow.
It was
Yeah.
lethal.
Interestingly enough, if you want to know, this is based on a number of studies, and one of the studies was the Quebec one on Memphremagog and
Right.
Lake Lovering, yeah, which suggested, I think, 680 feet, you know. They did not get a rule up there,
They're trying, they're still
Yeah.
trying up there.
yeah.
Well, and there are also, people were saying that wake boats don't get trailered from lake to lake, so we took a running count at the greeter program at Seymour, and we had 8 wake boats come in the month of August, so that part wasn't true. So they do get trailered from lake to lake.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's always something.
Yes. Yeah. No, but that's a good.
Yeah. So question, if you managed to, there were 60 some odd projects, and you managed to do more than 50% of them?
So we completed 30%. They're like done, and then
Okay.
another 60%. So about 90% are either done or have significant progress made along them. And some of them are written in ways that are like, continue to support the VIP program, so you're never completed. So
Okay.
And they're not, like, a lot of them are discrete projects, more like initiatives and programs,
Mm.
yeah,
so.
yeah. And I guess another point to make is that we have our watershed projects database where we have a couple hundred, or I don't know how many for this watershed, of individual projects, and that's more like, here's the stormwater treatment project here, versus the tactical basin plan says we want to implement all of our stormwater projects. And so we have a pretty large number of those, although most of those aren't being done just because they depend on landowner interests. So there's a lot of good potential buffer planting projects or stream restoration projects, but if you don't have a landowner that wants to do that project, it just kind of sits there and we wait until.
Is there funding to help them?
Yeah.
Or implement?
Well, that's a challenge. So you can, for things like we're working to purchase lands or to do easements, and so landowners can get a good chunk of money if they're willing to go one of those routes. And then there's some other things like planting trees or just doing buffer planting projects. And if you're a large farmer, you can get some good money through our Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, but if you're just a homeowner, through our Trees for Streams program, there's generally not. So a little bit depends on the situation. So sometimes there's money, sometimes not.
So my last question is, are you positive we're making headway?
That's a great question. Not yet.
No,
Yes.
that was nasty.
No, it's a good question, and I think there's some real questions, like we have our tracking and accounting,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of assumptions that go into that. And so one of the things that that's exciting to me about this watershed is we do have our water quality monitoring program. And so we actually have gone out and working with the Orleans County Conservation District where we're implementing these agricultural best management practices. And we sample before those practices are implemented and try to figure out actually where we need to do those practices, and then we monitor after the fact. And I think we've done studies in like 14 drainage areas where we've implemented these practices, and I think 9 of those we've been able to show statistically significant reductions in phosphorus concentrations. And so when you have a really significant problem and you fix it, we are seeing some positive results. You don't quite see that trickle down into the concentrations on Lake Memphremagog because there's like so much going on in this watershed that even though we're making progress in these localized areas, there's a lot of other things going on and there's a lot of natural variability. So it's a little bit hard to know if we're making progress in terms of concentrations in the lake or in our major tributaries. But then again, I think it's also having Patrick and Meg really working hard on some of the projects, and it's really exciting to start to see some of the projects that are being developed and that are coming forward for some funding. And I think there's some real good potential in those to start to bend the curve a little bit, and they're a little bit different than, I think you need to do a bunch of different projects. Like right now we're working a lot with farmers, but working with farmers and then working on river restoration and wetland restoration as well to trap some of the phosphorus that we can't stop at the farm or at the road. I think you really need to do all of those things together. And so it's kind of exciting to see that new area taking off. And so I've got some, yeah, and the other thing that's nice is we have the funding through the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission that I think has really helped to galvanize some of that, and so it's allowed some of the local organizations to build capacity to do that work. And so there are projects that I've been wanting to see happen for 10 years, and they're just happening now because we have people on the ground that are knocking on the doors and are surprisingly convincing and getting people to say yes. So I think that's where I see a lot of the positive.
Now we got 2 people doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
I do want to make a pitch for the 2 landowners, perhaps, that are interested. If you do know properties where you might think that there could be water quality benefits to be had, fish habitat could be improved, talk to us because we can get a lot of funding depending on the type of project. So.
Yeah.
Jennifer, it's a good question. Like, I drive around and I see a lot of ditching and I see a lot of grading and, even I've only been here 3 years and it just seems like there's a lot more home site constructions, and so it's definitely an uphill battle, but I think we're starting to get to like a, terminal velocity in terms of people recognizing the work that needs to be done and actually being able to put some in the ground to show what it looks like and get people excited about it. Reaching different audiences, so there's going to be a lag.
I was thinking about the same thing, like in a similar way to how the reclassification can help address problems a little earlier in their development. Is there the potential to fund more of a stop loss program that would help fund people to go out and to these sites and say, hey, what you're doing, maybe don't do it, or here are some things you can do to help mitigate this, or maybe funding additional EEOs or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that came up at our other meeting last week, and it's really challenging when you're seeing, I've seen people out there that have their little forest lot and they've decided they want to put ditches through their forest and essentially creating these gullies. And it's hard, there's so many of those little actions that can happen across the landscape. And some of those things are enforcement and some of them aren't. And I think it's a tough, we've thought about I think they need to have a multiple pronged approach. One is also just trying to increase the information out there around what good practices are and trying to minimize those things before they start. And I think the hard thing is once someone is into that enforcement world, then we can't pay to fix it through our funding program. So, I guess there's still opportunities in the agricultural landscape. We certainly work with farmers trying to come into compliance with things. So I think that's certainly possible, but you have to be a little bit creative in terms of the funding source, or just thinking about it in terms of outreach versus project implementation. Because I think it's a little tough to restore some of those things after they've just happened and claim phosphorus credit, because then you're not necessarily making, you're preventing things from getting worse, but you're not improving things, so you don't want to count that in the positive because it's but we also don't want to ignore that's going on landscape. So.
And if we started accounting the negatives, we'd feel really bad.
The negatives
Yeah.
can happen so quickly, too.
Yeah.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, there is a little analysis they've done. The National Land Cover Data Set has done a pretty good job of looking at land use change over time. And we do see, like, the Derby area, like that, a lot of development happening in Derby and a lot of development happening around our lake shores. So I think the Willoughby watershed, we saw a fair amount of development happening. So that is, you know, as development happens, there are tighter regulations. So we've gotten down to a half an acre that people have to treat stormwater if they're doing a new development. But most home sites aren't going to get to that half an acre of impervious surface unless you have a pretty long driveway or a pretty big house or parking area. So there's a lot of development still happening outside of that. And
Yeah.
so that is a challenge, and there is part of our TMDL, like we account for allowing some of that development to happen. And so we have a little bit of an allocation to say, okay, we know there's going to be some more development and some more stormwater runoff. So we've actually increased how much phosphorus we need to reduce to essentially acknowledge that that's happening out there in the landscape.
Yeah, I think this also came up last week, is that there are a lot of these new like regulatory protections or like regulatory kind of measures to try to reduce impacts, but I'm not sure that that's getting down to the town level. You know, and that like the zoning, the planning, the select board people are really getting like versed in it or exposed in it or trained in it. So it is something where like at the state level they're trying to make these efforts, but like it's not necessarily trickling down to like Billy Bob's building a house. He doesn't know that they're supposed to get permits for certain activities or for certain impacts, and no one's the wiser because it's just, you know, you've got a 3/4 time clerk and volunteer select, you know, so it's kind of tough to really have some person who's committed and like dedicated and like on being just having the capacity to like be on top of, you know, pretty rapid sprawl or just like very widespread and not so tight development going on in all corners of the town that they can't have eyes on all the time. So.
Patrick, if you want an opportunity to make an impact in Newport, there's a meeting here in this building next Tuesday evening. I think it's 6:30. And it's about the new zoning regulations or what they're proposing to do. It's the new plan.
The municipal plan?
No,
the zoning
just
plan.
the zoning. They want to redo the zoning regulations. It would be a perfect place
I'll send you the link.
for both of you to come.
Yeah, I need a
I
couple
have it
more
on the
committees to sit
agenda.
on.
Good.
So-
This is my last meeting for a while, Pat.
With the at the meeting on the 18th, there was some hubbub about a land trust.
Yep.
Is that the kind of thing that could make it into a strategy?
Yes.
And are you thinking of adding it?
Yeah, so that was one thing I was going to try to work with Sarah on, and the way we work these plans is it's kind of interesting. We try to have most of these discussions in the kind of informal phase so that we can have our draft plan pretty good, but we know we miss things. So if someone provides us a comment that says we really need to develop capacity for land conservation organizations working in this region, that's a real barrier for us, then I think we can certainly essentially like respond to that comment, say great point, and then add that in there. You know, we're probably going to try to avoid adding anything into the plan that's going to be particularly controversial because we don't want to do that without giving the public a little bit more of a chance to weigh in. But I think increasing capacity of land conservation organizations is pretty straightforward and the type of thing that we consider just adding in there for that final plan. Yeah, I'm not sure. I was going to talk with Sarah a little bit. There were a couple ideas that came out of that meeting that seemed like it might be worth considering. Some revisions to the plan. So that's definitely, that's kind of the point of this public comment process, is to get those ideas and try to revise the plan in a way that makes it better. And then essentially I go out and have a conversation with the commissioner of the department and the agency secretary and if they're on board with whatever we say, then that's the. Yeah. Well, I definitely appreciate everyone coming out tonight on a nice night.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, and I really, especially for all of you that have helped work on the plans throughout the way, Meg and Patrick, definitely appreciate your support in that.